Hello, folks. Let's approach today the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean. I will start by taking stock on where the region was prior to COVID, prior to the pandemic, and then we will discuss how has been the impact in the region and what are the likely scars that will have to be dealt with in the region. Okay, so where we were. And I will use as a reference not only the last chapter on my book, right? That you have it, but also the major content of these two reports. This one from the World Bank and this one from the IDB, and you have the links in the syllabus. Okay, and of course, this is still an unfolding crisis. So we have to take into account the fact that some of the figures that you will see will need to be updated as time passes by. But in any way, let me start with the where we were, where the region was right prior to the COVID. Look, for the previous 5 years prior to 2020, the economic performance of Latin America and the Caribbean had been disappointing for reasons that we have already discussed, with growth rates being barely positive on average. Supporting the trends in social spending made possible by unusually high commodity price was becoming increasingly difficult, which confronted many countries with painful adjustments. And over 2019, not by chance, we saw the eruption of social unrest across the region, reflecting to a large extent a widening gap between popular expectations and economic and social realities. And then in early 2020, we started to watch the several shocks afflicting the region from outside and inside. But what this chart shows us is exactly why some people call the first decade of the new millennium as the golden decade, because we watched rapid economic growth and steady progress on social indicators. And, it was a boom time with respect to commodity price for the reasons that we have already discussed here. And this time, historically, it was combined with social policies that had a positive impact on poverty and even in income distribution. The At least taken as a reference the wage distribution, we had a flattening of the Gini coefficient with respect to wage, even if, of course, the analysis by Piketty and his colleagues on looking at the top income of the top 1% using tax records and so on show that the rich remain doing quite well. But in any case, for the bulk of the population, the perception was one of growth and with some income distribution. And the chart shows clearly how, let's say, this was true until the global financial crisis that you see in the chart. And then the reasonably fast recovery after the global financial crisis can be seen in the growth rates in 2010. This, of course, has to do a lot with the weight of Brazil in those figures. But since then, the average has come down, as you can see. Okay, uh, and and the fact is that since then, since the end of the commodity price super cycle, the average economic growth of countries in the region has been quite similar or even slower than that of the much richer advanced economies, which slashed the hopes of a long-term convergence. But let's look at the difference among subregions because they matter. Look, this chart, uh, although it shows that the growth had slowed down across all subregions, here we have here the World Bank report gathers the countries of the Atlantic side, the Pacific, right, including the Pacific Alliance and so on, and the Caribbean. Given the very unique disastrous situation of Venezuela, the this estimate here regarding the Atlantic excludes Venezuela. Okay. Now, what this chart tells us to a large extent is, apart from the most extreme economic meltdown of Venezuela, uh, it appears that some countries in the region have done better than others. Overall, countries in the Caribbean sub-region held better, with their economies gradually decelerating, but not collapsing. At the other hand, uh, at the other side, the worst performance was associated with countries in the Atlantic sub-region, with both Argentina and Brazil experiencing recessions over the last few years. Uh, the other countries, including the countries in the Pacific sub-region, that is to say Mexico, the Andean countries of South America, had a somewhat intermediate performance. However, the last couple of years prior to 2020 had been characterized by a steady slowdown across all subregions. Let me also uh, exhibit this other chart, which breaks down the real GDP growth by individual countries. And what you can note out of it is that, well, look, the growth rate of the region is heavily influenced by the three largest economies, namely Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And in recent years, all three went through recessions or slowdowns. So that's why, from this perspective, it may be more meaningful to consider the median growth rate, not the average. The median is the statistic that splits the countries in two parts rather than the average growth rate. But even by this metric, even if when we would consider the median growth rate, Latin America and the Caribbean grew by a disappointing 1.7% in 2019. Only three countries in the region, Dominica, Dominican Republic, and Guyana, had growth rates in excess of 4%. Even other traditionally strong performers in recent years, Panama and Colombia, were again, they were again among the countries with the highest growth rates, as you can see in the chart. But decelerations were common across the region, and many countries ended 2019 without any growth. Haiti, Argentina, and Nicaragua experienced outright declines in economic activity. And so, with the slow growth as a feature of the region for several years, the emergence of social unrest was something new. You may recall, during 2019, a dozen countries in Latin America and the Caribbean saw the outburst of strikes, demonstrations, and riots, resulting in considerable violence, as we recall. The proximate causes varied substantially across countries. In some cases, they were directly related to economic development with the economic crisis, while others were clearly political in nature. But violence levels were high across the board, leading to large numbers of dead and injured people, together with significant material damage. Down the path of the course, we will have the moments where we will discuss social issues and violence. But for the time being, it behooves us to highlight how things were not, let's say, uh, going pretty well. Uh, and then we have the coronavirus. And the coronavirus has affected dramatically the region. As you can see in this chart, and the figures uh, since this chart was produced by the World Bank have not changed very much the landscape. By measuring by the COVID-19 deaths per million people, the region is definitely among those most affected. And this comes associated with a deep economic crisis. All over the world, whatever the COVID hit substantially, and depending on the response adopted in the countries and so on, being successful or not in containing the spread of the COVID-19, the economic crisis has been deep, comparable worldwide only to the Great Depression, the period of the Great Depression. And in this case, it's worldwide. And let's understand. It's important to highlight what is specific to the economic crisis associated to the COVID-19, which is primarily a sanitary crisis. Look, typically the typical cycles, including moments of recession and crisis in normal times in the economies, they're associated with, let's say, industrial cycles, moments of overexpansion in capacity that is followed by downside phases of cycles, or they are financial crises. In this case, in the case of the COVID-19, it's basically a sanitary crisis that leads to the necessity of containing the pandemic curve. Definitely, you guys heard a lot about the two curves to be flattened since the outburst of the COVID crisis last year, namely the infection curve, that one needs to dampen the pace of infection so as to avoid an excessive pressure on the capacity, limited health capacity, to avoid, let's say, or to minimize what we watched in northern Italy in the beginning of last year. That is to say, people dying with doctors having to choose which patients to put into the ventilators and so on. And we are watching a lot of this strain and corresponding death now in Brazil, and particularly in some parts of Brazil. We watch this in the state of Amazonas, because exactly the pace of infection outrunning the existing health capacity to attend patients. So the first overriding necessity in any country, in any region affected by the spread of the virus, is to contain the rate of infection. And well, the Asians were able, or most of the Asians, the successful case, and I have in mind here not only China, but South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, China, and so on. They used information, the collection of information, the use of apps, so as to trace the infected people, their contacts, and set them apart. Whatever this was not, let's say, possible, the only resort has been social distancing. Either mandatory social distancing with prohibitions with labor, with the restrictions to mobility established by authorities, or to the least by voluntary social distancing with people, those who can and who are who understand the risks and so on, avoiding agglomerations. That is to say, going to restaurants, going to theaters, getting them together, and so on. In both cases, let's say, The restrictions to mobility tended to affect primarily the supply. So the COVID-19 crisis has a component of supply shock, negative supply shock. That was the clear case, for instance, in China when the whole economy came to a halt. As time passed by, some adaptation has taken place, particularly in the case of manufacturing industry. In the case of agriculture, the issue of agglomeration during production is less notable. But where the issue of supply shock and demand shock both appeared clearly was in the service, and it will remain like this because, as I said, the voluntary social distancing will keep the demand for service, for contact intensive service, very dampened. Of course, on the that is the case of contact intensive service, whereas the high tech service have boomed because of the working from home and the increasing use of remote techniques to work and remote work and so on. But the negative impact, economic impact, was has been dramatic and let's say proportionate to the failures of countries to contain the spread of the virus. There is this clear correlation. Now, let's look at something, the difficulties for emerging markets and developing countries to cope with the infection curve. The first obvious aspect to highlight, part of the population in those countries, emerging markets and developing countries, live in slums. And it's obviously hard to have social distancing with people living in slums. And as you can see, this chart, you have, of course, the presence of slums to a high degree in many parts in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean. Look at Brazil here, Mexico, and Haiti. So inherently, social distancing was harder to obtain in developing and emerging market economies. Not only that, of course, as a trend or as a general feature, the health capacity tends to be, let's say, smaller in these countries. Even among the advanced economies, you have a differentiated situation. The coronavirus crisis revealed how, for instance, the German health system was better equipped to deal with it in terms of size, in terms of capacity, as well to trace and approach the contacts. But whereas compares this with the situation in Italy. So if this is true among advanced economies, and the issues vary. In the case of the US, you don't have universal access to healthcare. If this is true among advanced economies, you can imagine the case of developing countries and emerging market economies. Also, to point out, there are two curves to be flattened, using the language that became so popular since last year. To flatten the infection curve, but also to the extent of possible to flatten the recession curve, because we are talking about with the restrictions to mobility and with the dire impact on contact intensive service, many people, part of the population, came on the brink of starvation, of death either by the disease or by simply not getting the money to buy food, given the dependence, given the strong rate of occupation of the people at the bottom of the pyramid with a contact intensive service. And in fact, that's not by chance that all over the world, or at least most part of the world, the coronavirus was taken as a natural catastrophe. And under conditions of natural catastrophe, the only insurer of last resort is the state, is the public sector. And with different intensities and shapes, we watched all over the world the implementation of packages that were seen as packages taken in countries living through wars. It was a war situation. And in the case of emerging markets and developing countries, you may also understand an additional difficulty, which is the high degree of informality in deployment of the labor force. Just to give an idea, and why the informality in this case matters, because a common component or very frequent component of those policies for flattening the recession curve, for dealing with the tragic situation of part of the population, was the use of transfers. That was the case in advanced economies. In the case of the US, checks distributed to households. In the case of France, a little bit differently, money transferred to companies for companies to keep the workers being paid in the job. But also, in the case of Brazil, for instance, in a short time span, the registry was expanded, and the emergency aid package ended up sending money to 65 plus million Brazilians. Can you imagine this? 65 is a huge proportion of the adult population in Brazil, which has 220 million inhabitants. But the absence of registries and of formalization made everything more difficult, because non-registered, non-informal workers don't have access to unemployment insurance. And the picture is bleak. Brazil has, for instance, something, or had, of 45% of the labor force formalized. But when you pick up a country in sub-Saharan Africa like Nigeria, then this proportion of informal workers rise up to 90%, 90. So everything becomes more difficult even to implement the flattening the recession curve policies. And this has a lot to do with the difficulties to cope with not only the impact of the crisis, but also with, let's say, coping with the consequences of what's going to, the scars that we're going to refer to. Now, look, also not by chance, given the difference in terms of capacity of countries to respond to the COVID, to the pandemic curves, we are watching a divergence in the recoveries after since last year, because obviously the major impact came by waves as the COVID appeared in different countries in the first half of last year, and starting on the second half of last year, when apparently, let's say, the first wave started to wane, started to disappear, then we started to watch a recovery, a increasing, if not full normalization, but a recovery of the way things were done before. This was the case particularly of China, as you can see, first in, first out. And that's why China had the closest to a V-shaped recovery, as you can see. Look, this chart is that I took from the World Economic Outlook update in January, shows you the following. The dot lines are the trajectories of GDP in the corresponding groups of countries as envisaged, as forecast in January of 2020. And then the chart here compares with what has happened and what are the forecasts established in January of this year. And that, as you can see, China recovers fast. And but notes that even China will not be able to go unscathed by the pandemic, because the GDP, as forecast by the IMF, in the following years will be below what they would be in the absence of COVID-19, among other reasons, because the rest of the world will be experiencing lower growth. So China will suffer the impacts of lower exports. But look at the yellow one is the case of the emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China. Okay, look at how it was perceived to be the trajectory. The trajectory was perceived to be in January of last year, and how in fact now we see this one. See the impact, the negative impact seems to be a permanent one, the loss of GDP. And keep in mind that this is an average, right, that hides, that conceals huge heterogeneity among emerging markets and developing economies, including the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, as we will note very, very soon. But also in the case of the advanced economies, look at this. Advanced economies, also the trajectory will not be one of full recovery. That is to say, the loss of GDP is definitive. This will not be recovered. And these economies might return to the GDP trajectory later on, but with the loss in between. And this is what this the right side of the chart also shows. This is the estimate of the GDP losses relative to the pre-COVID by region. And look at this: emerging market Asia, excluding China, -8. LAC, and this is also an average, because here, just to give an idea, and we'll see very soon, the impact, the negative impact of COVID in the region varied substantially among countries. But overall, for the region, look at this. This is Sub-Saharan Africa. This is Middle East and Central Asia, in the regional classification of the IMF. The average for the emerging market developing economies, world, emerging Europe, advanced economies, China, see, there will be GDP losses, as I said, and the United States. Look at this. This is overall the number of economies where the per capita real GDP will still be smaller than the ones of 2019. And this year and last year, you had 180 countries, roughly, below the previous year. Even in 2021, not many countries will be able to recover even the levels of 2019. Look at this. And even in 2022. This is to say, many economies will only be able to return to where they were in terms of per capita real GDP, where they were in 2019, only by 2023. That's a huge impact. Now, going back, as I said, flattening the recession curve, accompanying the flattening, the attempts, the struggle to flatten the infection curve. And in fact, in the region, for instance, several countries have adopted sizable stimulus packages. This shows the size of the fiscal, and this is still ongoing. For instance, there is now the Brazilian Congress is as of today, as of these days, discussing a possible package of a new round of emergency aid distribution at a smaller scale for a narrow range of Brazilians, but still, even in 2021, we are watching some I don't like to call them stimulus package because it's not really stimulus. Uh, it is salvation. It is a rescue of people under really dreadful conditions. But in any case, it's still the denomination stimulus packages applies to some extent because they had an impact on avoiding deeper downfalls of the GDP. In the case of Brazil, as I said, in the beginning of, in April of last year, the estimates, the forecasts about the Brazilian GDP ranged in things like -8 from the World Bank, -9 World Bank, IMF, and OECD. And the figures coming out yesterday presented the Brazilian GDP as falling by 4.1%. And this only happened because of the humongous stimulus package as depicted here. But interestingly is to look at this variation. Look at the case of Mexico, which surprised many, given, let's say, the supposedly left-leaning orientation of AMLO. The expectation was that any kind of rescue package like this would be big in Mexico. In Mexico, enjoys a fiscal condition much better than, for instance, it is the case of Brazil currently. Nonetheless, the size of the package in Mexico was small. But look at the size in Peru and Chile, like in Brazil. Anyway, this ended up helping to explain those are the forecasts of the World Bank presented in the Global Economic Outlook of January. Okay, so of course the figures regarding the estimates for 2020 were temporary then, and some of these are only now being confirmed or adjusted. As you can see, Brazil here had -4.5%, and whereas the actual figures coming yesterday pointed to -4.1. But overall, see the difference among countries. Look at the downfall of GDP expected forecast by the World Bank, something close to 10% or 20% in Belize. You will understand a bit why some of the reasons for the variation in these figures. But still, Guatemala, Guyana is a case apart because of the oil investments and so on. But overall, the picture is gloomy. Look at Suriname, look at St. Lucia. And in the case of these Caribbean countries, I will explain something quite important ahead. But look at how the recovery expected for this year, the ongoing year, or even including the next year, they do not recover the loss during 2020. It's not the case of Argentina, nor Belize, not even Brazil to be seen. Okay? All right, okay. But let me say the following. Look, as you may notice, I'm trying to highlight what is common between Latin America and the Caribbean and other emerging markets and developing economies, and what is specific. That's the juggle that I'm trying to let's say, to exercise here. For instance, when it comes to the impact of the coronavirus, there is something in common of Latin America and the Caribbean and other emerging markets and developing countries, which led me to write at some moment, and I guess in the chapter of the book, the expression appears, of coronavirus as a perfect storm. And why is that? Well, look, there were the difficulties common to these countries with respect to containing the containment of the infection curve, and the difficulties, the common difficulties that I mentioned to different degrees, to implement the flattening the recession curve policies. Yeah, that's common. But also, something additionally in common among these countries was the fact that even before the coronavirus started to spread in these countries, the emerging markets and developing countries suffered shocks from abroad. One of them was the financial shock in March. Just to give an idea, particularly after the situation became so desperate in northern Italy, financial markets realized, everyone globally, that the issue of the COVID was not something that would remain confined to China or to some neighbor countries in Asia, that it was global. The wake-up call happened when the situation in northern Italy got to where it was, and you may remember definitely the images and so on. And then there was a rush toward the safety of either cash and or short-term treasuries, the U.S. treasuries, which is the safest harbor and so on, even abdicating from EUs, abdicating from earns. But the search for safety was overriding. And that led to a liquidation of assets all over the world. People selling assets, stocks to buy cash or short-term treasury, people selling corporate debt, securities, and also people selling emerging market assets. Just to give you an idea of the figure that we are referring to here, in 3 weeks of March of last year, $100 billion left emerging markets. It had never happened any capital outflow in that magnitude. And this is let's say illustrated here in this chart by the impact of coronavirus on the stock market. Look at how they dived. This is March, okay? At the same time, of course, the response by the Federal Reserve Bank and also by the other major central banks like the European Central Bank and also in Japan and so on, with the new rounds of quantitative easing, new rounds of liquidity provision to the markets and so on, this shock was contained. And that's what is reflected here in the return of the assets to a better place. This is, you have the Nikkei, the Shanghai, Dow Jones, the Italy, the index, the FTSE, and so on. They return. If not all shares going back exactly to where they were before the shock, but with a substantial recovery, particularly in the case of Japan and China, and also with a further boost when the first vaccine was announced. And this, of course, also was accompanied by a partial return, in some cases, in some other cases of emerging markets and developing economies, a full return of the money that had went out. And this appears, for instance, in the evolution of the exchange rates of the emerging markets, including this chart refers to the G20 countries. So the sample, the Latin American and Caribbean countries, including the sample, are only the ones that are there at the G20. That is to say, Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil. This is South Africa, this is Indonesia, and this is Russia, Turkey, and India. And as you can see, look, this compares the position, this reflected in the evolution of the exchange rates. In some cases, the devaluation because of the capital outflows taking place in the month of March was almost fully reversed, as you can see. In the case of Mexico, Russia, not really. But as you can see in some cases, like Argentina, Turkey, and Brazil, there was not, at least until October the 30th, there was not full recovery of the previous levels. The capital flows did not return fully in the Brazilian case. The picture improved a bit after that with a new wave of capital inflows. But for instance, just to give you an idea, yesterday, it was a nightmare with capital outflows expressing themselves in exchange rate devaluation in Brazil. So this picture is still evolving. But in any case, I want to highlight the financial shock that affected emerging markets and developing economies and Latin America and the Caribbean. But also three other shocks that are, let's say, the importance of those three shocks vary by country because of the difference in dependence of the countries with respect to those three shocks that I'm going to mention. One of them, tourism, okay? One of the, obviously, first contact intensive service to suffer a setback, a paralysis. Travels, air trips, trips by road to a lower extent, but you had definitely, that's where the major impact of the coronavirus, one of the spots exactly on tourism, on hospitality, on hotels. And this expresses itself on the crumbling of the global tourism industry. And the impact in the region varied. Brazil, for instance, is a net importer of tourism service. There's more outflow of tourists from Brazil than inflows. So the paralysis of travels from the balance of payment standpoint was, let's say, positive for the foreign exchange accounts in Brazil because many less tourists left out. But think of the Caribbean or some parts of Central America or Mexico, which receive in normal times a huge amount of tourism. This was a tremendous shock, and it has not recovered yet, as you know. Remittance. Those figures that I'm putting there on the slide, they're kind of outdated because they came from the Migration and Remittance Report released by the World Bank in October. And the World Bank was very much pessimistic about the evolution of remittance. As you can see in the figure, look at the percentage of decline in remittance that the World Bank then was expecting for each one of the regions, East Asian, Pacific, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and so on. For understandable reasons, because the bulk of the migrants are working in contact-intensive service, transportation, hotels, domestic service, cutting your lawn, and so on. And so since the coronavirus impact was mostly on service, it was expected a huge, terrible negative impact on the income of those migrants. The thing not taken into account by the bank, which revealed quite important in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, was the spillover from the stimulus packages from the flattening the recession curve policies adopted in these countries. Probably as part of the household checks distributed in the US, the remittance to the sources of migrants in Central America and parts of the Caribbean, didn't suffer that much. And something like this also happened. I was in a seminar yesterday in Morocco, and the guys there were explaining that the impact on remittance for Morocco was as well less negative than expected, because exactly the spillover of the policies to contain the recession adopted in Europe. But anyway, and the weight of remittance is dramatically high and relevant in several cases of countries in the region. That's the case of Haiti. That's the case of El Salvador. That's the case of to some extent Ecuador, but also Guyana and so on. So this channel of impact, this shock through remittance, is also to be taken into account and consider being as it has been considerable in the case of some countries in the region. And also, of course, the other natural channel through which the coronavirus impacted the region has been through the commodity prices, as we have discussed in previous sessions, particularly in the case of those oil producers. It was less so in the case of agriculture and even metals. Agriculture, indeed, it was not all bad. China remained buying a lot of soybeans and the agriculture in Brazil and in other parts of the region boomed last year. What saved? I spoke about minus 4.1% as a negative growth of GDP in Brazil last year, but that also reflected the fact that agriculture kept spending its sector GDP last year. So it's not a substantial chunk of the GDP, but the growth was positive enough to let's say to help the average to not to be as bad. But the commodity price shock was the negative aspects stemming from the oil price decline, even if it's recovering. And if we go to the first months of this year here, if I had an updated chart, I should have brought one. We have watched recovery of price to the point that some analysts even speak about a new super cycle of commodity prices, which is indeed certainly an exaggeration. But anyway, to take note of the commodity price shock. Now, let me say a bit about these cars. The issue is not only the loss of GDP as we approached, but also the new normal will not be exactly equal to the prior to COVID scenario. That will be a legacy in terms of public debt to different degrees, because of the not only the loss of GDP that will make the existing public debt higher as a share to GDP, but also because of the fiscal package that we approached. But also the impact of the coronavirus, of the pandemic, has been unequal. It has been unequal by sectors, as I have mentioned, and I will illustrate this in the case of the US, but also unequal in terms of impact. The lower strata of the income pyramid has been the ones mostly affected, and particularly by gender, by age and by gender. In the typical normal recessions, the impact usually comes mostly on men who are employed in who have a higher share of occupancy in manufacturing. But in the case of service, the women have a higher, let's say, a higher presence in relative terms vis-a-vis the men. So the women have been more affected. Not to speak of the burden that is already higher for women in household chores. And now you had a combination of staying at home. The burden has been particularly harder on women. But job-wise, the women have been more affected. And inequality has increased and will remain like that in all over the world, wherever you had the coronavirus. And and the likelihood of structural unemployment, because most likely, this is one of those areas where we can only imagine, but not predict with accuracy, with a minimum in a solid manner. But it is possible that we will not return to where we were in terms of occupancies and jobs and so on. And that will lead to structural unemployment and the challenge of reskilling of many of these workers that will no longer have. To the least, it will take long before we have, if we will ever go back to have the same number of restaurants and hotels and even if while minimum protocols are being used in terms of distancing and so on, the amount of people, of the rate of occupancy of the installed capacity will be lower. So we will be facing structural unemployment for a long time. And as you saw, the recovery of GDP, and even if we go back to the old normal or we get close to the old normal, it's going to take long, as you saw by the figures regarding GDP vis-a-vis GDP per capita vis-a-vis 2019. But also, most likely, working from home will be something more frequent, and this is to be seen. This is one of the major unknowns of the new normal after coronavirus. And also, of course, the COVID-19 has accelerated technological change. To some extent, the coronavirus can be said to have not changed history, but accelerated history. Some of the trends that were there have been simply sped up. That's the case of the technological change. The digitalization in service, as well as the digitalization in industrial production processes that we discussed in our previous session, is being spurred in the sense that, well, it works. And so this will mean that the crisis will have probably spurred, accelerated the technological change. And for several reasons, we don't have the time to go through here, but there is some discussion in the chapter of my book and also some videos of mine, and we can discuss this. There will be most likely a partial reversal of globalization, of what we discussed in the previous session, in the sense that, to the least, most countries will redefine the line of what they call strategic sectors in order to make sure that they have local production. That's obviously going to be the case of medicaments and of medical equipment and so on. The overdependence on China or India, in the case of vaccines, has scared many countries. And we have seen reference to this. President Macron in France talking about the redefinition of the strategic line of sectors. President Biden referring to this. It's expected that we're going to see, to the least in the case of some sectors like medicaments, but we might see more. This will go in tandem, and it will intertwine with the rivalry between U.S. and China. The only, let's say, silver line of this whole thing was the fact that the perception of the need of cooperative solutions to global issues has increased. And that applies to pandemics. The pandemic will not be completely ended while there's still spots in the world with high rates of infection and so on, because the high rates of infection create the possibility, we have seen this, of new variants of the virus. We have seen the UK, the British variant. We saw the variant in South Africa, and now we are seeing the variant in the case of Brazil. And they run the risk of, let's say, the new variants, which reflect, it's a mathematical issue. The higher the rate of infection, the likelihood of variants to show up, of mutation, is higher. And they may even make the existing vaccines not effective. So either have the global resolution of the pandemics, or the risk will still be there of flowing back. And while and this is happening while we see the inequality or the different paces of vaccination. While in advanced economies are steady fast to different degrees. My French wife says that this is not the case in Europe, but here in the US, you're watching the accelerated vaccination. It's going sluggishly in many emerging markets and developing countries, and some developing countries have not even started the vaccination. So we need to have a global approach to issues like pandemics, even if we are watching different paces of vaccinations in the world. And the climate change as well. It's interesting to note how the attention, the consideration, the appraisal of climate change issues has increased during the coronavirus crisis. More people have realized that nature bites back, that nature may be, let's say, may respond to the bad things that we do to it. And the same applies to cybersecurity and demographic change. But let me show you, just illustrate this point by looking at this. Look, I'm using here the US change in employment by sector. And this evolution here is very much, let's say, symbolic of what has happened in each and every place. So you have different impacts by sectors. Of course, healthcare deployment does not fall. On the contrary, it recovers faster. But look at what happened with retail trade and leisure and hospitality. The recovery has not been, by November, close to going back to where it was. And passenger transportation is still declining, and so on. So the impact in employment, the negative impact varies by sector dramatically. And this ends up, as I said, affecting particularly the bottom of the pyramid. See, this is the most recent forecast by the World Bank on the evolution of the global poverty line. Look at this. Look at before coronavirus, the World Bank was expecting this steady decline in the number of people in the percentage of the global population living with $1.9 a day or less. Okay, so look at this. 2015, 10%, progress towards 9.2 in 2017, 8.4 for 2019. And the trajectory would stay downward were not for coronavirus. And then you have, this is the baseline, see? And this is, let's say, the in the case of the dire forecast with the let's say, the downside scenario. So the impact on global poverty rate has been, as you can see there, and uh, also in lack, particularly in lack. Look at this. Uh, we saw in the previous years, as we spoke, massive transition from to middle class, with a downfall of people living with $5.5 a day or less, and the rise of the middle class living between $13 and $70 a day. Look, this is the progress and that we mentioned too, refer to, with a decline in people living in vulnerable conditions. But then the performance had not been that great in 2019, which has not been a good year, as we saw. But look at what happens in 2020. Decline in the middle classes and the rise in people in poor conditions, like in the rest of the world. And we're talking about rising inequality in the most unequal region in the world, okay? So Gini coefficient going up. As I said, the unevenness of the impact on workers. For instance, this compares the impact on workers in advanced economies and in emerging markets and developing economies according to the skills. Red, low education, blue, high education. As you can see, the impact both in advanced economies and in emerging markets and developing economies is higher on people with a lower education because of the occupancy associated with them that has been impacted by coronavirus. But also in terms of age, look, youth has been more affected than the prime age workers in both groups of countries. And look at this in the case of gender. Higher job losses and worse jobs among women, not only in total job losses, but also in temporary and permanent job losses. Tough. This is just a picture to illustrate the legacy in terms of higher public debt, right? Particularly, look at this as the evolution. This is an average in Latin America and the Caribbean, but it's broad, as you can see. And this is, I guess I have already showed this chart for you guys in previous sessions. And look at the impact of the coronavirus on world trade and the recovery that has not even, this was presented by the WTO in October. And you don't see at the end of 2021 a return even to the, let's say, slower trajectory of prior to COVID. There will be an impact, of course, of the school closures on human capital, because they are not exactly, let's say, the same results, particularly for those who don't have access to broadband and so on. And you have such a disparity, but only about half of Latin Americans have access to broadband. This is something to be made a priority in most countries in the region, given the probably features of the new normal. So tough crisis is still unfolding. Unfortunately, we are watching the Brazilian case as a special, let's say, dire straits. When it's hard to call it second wave, because maybe the first new wave has not even finished, but it certainly has to do with the new variants and so on. But the attitude of leaderships mattered. Brazil is paying a huge price for the lack of attitude by the federal government with respect to containing policies, coordinating policies, and denying the risk associated with the pandemics, and running after vaccines. So coronavirus has been a real tragic, and it will leave scars. On top of the difficulties and the challenges that the region was facing already before coronavirus, now you have the scars associated with coronavirus. Okay? But at least we will be able to define an agenda of what needs to be done to cope with those. That's basically the subject of the following sessions in our course. Thank you. See you.